Good evening, everybody, and welcome to History Author Talks. I'm glad to see so many of my regulars back and a lot of new faces. I always love to see my regulars, and I think it's terrific that we seem to always add new folks who join us. A special welcome to members of the Sons of the American Revolution in the Connecticut Society. I am going to remind everybody that I am your host, Roger Williams. I will be monitoring our questions that people will send using the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions for our authors, I ask that you use the chat feature, send me your questions, and we will ask those questions, time permitting, during the after the authors have made their presentations. Also, throughout the presentation, I'll be sending you links, and you can ask me any other questions you'd like to you ask during the show. Full disclosure, the books that are being presented tonight are books that I publish. As you all know, for those of you who are regulars, this is a show that features authors from all publishers. Tonight, I'm taking the prerogative of being not only the producer of this show, but also to highlight two of my own authors because they're terrific books, and I think that you're going to be very interested. As you all know, I also always invite a partner in history to join us to tell us a little bit about their venue or society. In this case, I've asked my friend and compatriot from the Sons of the American Revolution, Dave Perkins, from the Connecticut Society. Dave is the commander of the Connecticut Color Guard, and Dave is going to be telling us about the Friends of Fort Griswold. So I'm going to turn it over to Dave Perkins. Dave, over to you.
Well, thank you, Roger. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. Again, I'm the State Color Guard Commander for the Connecticut SAR, and the Battle of Fort Griswold, which is always the first weekend in September, is the big event on our calendar. And every year it's celebrated on the Sunday closest to September 6th, where we go and do a grave marking at Colonel Ledyard Cemetery. And then after doing that, we then go up to the fort, excuse me, we go up to the fort and we do a commemoration, usually what we call an illumination, where we march into the fort and we do a presentation. We light candles to represent the 88 defenders who were killed in the fort. And then we finish it off with a couple of speeches from local dignitaries, usually a musket salute and a wreath laying at the site where Colonel Ledyard was slain. It's a big event for the state on that side of the state because it's one of only two really large battles that took place in the state. And even more important from our perspective, it's because, you know, a local hero turned bad guy in General Benedict Arnold coming back with the British forces to actually burn New London and sack the town, and then come across and wipe out the garrison basically in a very brief battle. But for us, it's a big event. And this year now will be the 240th of the event from September 6, 1781. And we're looking forward to a lot of participation throughout the state from reenactor units that have already been enlisted to participate. There's a 2-day program that is draft has been tentatively put out there, and I could quickly show it on the screen, Roger, if you'd want to let me have share capability. Sure. Got it?
Yep, you can go ahead and share.
Okay. So again, this is just a draft, so please don't just don't snap this and do anything with it. But you can see it's a basically like you see in any other particular reenactment or event going on. There's time periods set up for different things. Basically, Saturday is the day where things kind of kick off. One of the more important, interesting features of this property is not only do we have the fort in itself on its original grounds, but right next to it is we have the Ebenezer Avery House, which is where a lot of the wounded were taken after the battle. But then there'll be the usual demonstrations of the units as they're setting up for the morning, doing a lot of drilling, making certain they understand what they're doing actually that day, followed by speakers. And then, of course, they'll take their break. But in the afternoon, it starts off. Oops, sorry about that. I went too fast. It starts off, let me just go a little slower here. Starts off with artillery display. And then following the artillery display, we go into, which is kind of exciting from our perspective, we're going to go into a skirmish. And the SAR, those members that are trained up will actually be allowed to skirmish as colonial soldiers, which is kind of exciting for my color guard guys. They're all like, oh my goodness, it's more than just a grave marking or carrying a flag. So this should be a lot of fun. And then we're going to repeat the same activity to some extent on Sunday. And then following Sunday at about 1 o'clock when things close, then we'll go into our traditional ceremony that evening, where we'll go to the cemetery first. We'll do a commemoration at his gravesite. We'll also represent 4 other Patriot graves that evening as well that have not been marked previously. And we'll say a few words at each of those sites and put in an SAR marker. And then, as I said, we'll migrate up to the fort to be part of what takes place up there. And it's a great ceremony. And then Monday, they've got some additional things going on that they haven't finalized. So the whole weekend is basically set up. But as to the fort itself and why this is so important, it was, if anybody understands the purpose of what New London was and what Governor Trumbull was doing, he ran quite the enterprise out of their privateers and other people with letters of credit to go out and harass British shipping and loyalist shipping and bring all those.
David,
yes,
this is part of what Jerry's going to be talking to us about.
All right, I apologize for that. Yeah. So I won't go any. Point is, it was a very important place, and let's put it this way: Benedict Arnold was very happy to come back and visit with us. I think that's where I'll leave it.
Okay, good. So sorry to cut you off, sir, but
no.
this is what Jerry's book. But so I'd just like to say, I mean, if any of you have ever been to a reenactment, you'll know how exciting these are. And as you can see from Dave's itinerary schedule, these guys really do it upright. And so with that, before we talk about the Fort Griswold, the battle at Fort Griswold, we're going to do this chronologically. So first, we have another battle that, as I have said in the title of this show, is a momentous battle that many have not really had focused on. As our author will tell you, like Rodney Dangerfield, it gets no respect, but it should. And both the author and I feel that this is a very important and significant part of our American history. So with that, I'd like to introduce David Price. David is actually the author of a trilogy on the 10 crucial days of the American Revolution, December 25th, 1776 to January 3rd, 1777. Those are the 10 crucial days. In addition to The Road to Assunpink Creek, David has also authored Rescuing the Revolution, the Unsung Patriot Heroes of the 10 Crucial Days of America's War for Independence, and John Haslet's World, an Ardent Patriot, the Delaware Blues, and the Spirit of 1776. I've published all of these books at Knox Press, and David's Revolutionary War blog, speaking of which I highly recommend, is featured on his website, dpauthor, as in davidpriceauthor.com. So that's dpauthor.com. He's also a historical interpreter at Washington Crossing Historic Park in Pennsylvania, and the Princeton Battlefield State Park in New Jersey. So with that, I'm very pleased to turn the mic over to David Price. David?
Thank you very much, Roger. Okay, hopefully the slides are up.
Yep.
Okay, so it's a pleasure to be here with you and Jerry to talk about these obscure battles. And in the interest of observing our time constraints, I'm going to skip over the nitty-gritty details of what happened on January 2nd, 1777, and instead focus on the thesis of my book. That is the argument for why what happened on that day was so important. And I'm going to do that through a combination of reading excerpts from the book and ad-libbing along the way. And then if we have time and there's interest in doing so, we can get into some of the more granular stuff in the Q&A. So what distinguishes this book, The Road to Assunpink Creek, from other chronicles of the 10 Crucial Days winter campaign of 1776, 1777, is its greater emphasis on the events of January 2nd, 1777, when George Washington's army fought a day-long running battle against a militarily superior foe and made a successful stand with its back to the Delaware River, avoiding the very real threat of total defeat and setting the stage for a dramatic counterattack against a surprised enemy. That encounter is variously known as the Battle of Assunpink Creek or the Second Battle of Trenton. And here's an image of the creek, that photo that was taken by yours truly a couple of winters ago, standing on the north side of the creek, looking south. And this is in the Mill Hill Historic District in downtown Trenton. So that battle was the second in a chain of 3 victories by the Continental Army under Washington during the 10-day period that, as you said, began on December 25th, 1776, which historians generally view as having dramatically altered the course of the Revolutionary War. This lightning sequence of triumphs reversed the momentum of the conflict just when it seemed that the quest for independence from Great Britain was on the verge of total defeat. The January 2nd battle has generally been given short shrift from a historiographic perspective, and especially downplayed relative to the other 2 American successes at the time. Those other 2 actions bookended the Assunpink Creek fight, but the impact of that middle engagement on the outcome of the Continental Army's 10-day campaign was at least as significant as the other events. The precursor to the battle at Assunpink was the Continental's legendary crossing of the Delaware River on Christmas night, 1776, and the next day's success against the contingent of German soldiers known to us as Hessians, who were occupying Trenton and who had been hired to fight for the British crown. This is a 19th century print by Illman Brothers based on a painting by an artist named Edward Henry that depicts Washington at the First Battle of Trenton against the Hessians on December 26th. The events of January 2nd, that is the fighting that occurred during the enemy's advance from Princeton to Trenton and at the Assunpink Creek itself on that pivotal day, segued into the Americans' overnight march around the enemy's left flank early on January 3rd, which led to the capstone victory of the 10 Crucial Days at the Battle of Princeton. Depicted here in John Trumbull's celebrated work. One of them.
Birds are making a racket, David.
That's my fan club.
Sorry.
All right, I just shut them out. Okay, so this slide is a rather oddball 19th century rendition of the fighting that occurred at Assunpink Creek late on January 2nd by an unknown artist. The events of that day provided the essential pivot point from the first American victory of the 10 Crucial Days to the last, by ensuring that the initial Trenton engagement 1 week earlier was not a one-day wonder, but the beginning of a chain of events that altered the whole character of the revolutionary contest. Had Washington been defeated at Assunpink Creek, his victory on Trenton on December 26th would have been a historical footnote, similar to the Battle of Harlem Heights, a minor American success the previous September that did nothing to alter the course of the nearly disastrous New York campaign. And there would have been no victory at Princeton on January the 3rd. The Assunpink engagement was arguably the most critical moment of the 10 Crucial Days. and perhaps the most unappreciated American victory in the Revolutionary War. In terms of the number of soldiers involved, it was the largest battle fought during these 10 remarkable days. It was the only one in which the enemy had a numerical advantage, the only one in which Washington's army had to fight both British and Hessian troops, the only one in which the Crown's forces were led by a British general, who also happened to be arguably the most competent and energetic field commander in His Majesty's army, AKA Charles Lord Cornwallis, coming to us through the efforts of John Singleton Copley around 1795, so well after the Revolution. And this battle was the only one during the 10 crucial days in which the geographic position of the Patriot forces put them at mortal peril of being trapped between two natural barriers, a creek on one side and a river on the other, with no means of evacuation if they were outflanked and driven back against the riverbank. January 2nd also featured the longest battle of the 10 crucial days. If one counts as a single encounter, the resistance by Colonel Edward Hand's men during their fighting withdrawal from Maidenhead, which is Lawrence Township today, to Trenton, and the shootout at the creek immediately following their delaying action. And the image you see here is that of the Big Shabakunk Creek, where Edward Hand's men put up their most determined and prolonged resistance during their fighting withdrawal along the post road from Princeton to Trenton on the afternoon of January 2nd. Perhaps most importantly, this occasion marked the first time that the Continental Army beat back an attack by British troops during a significant battle. As David Hackett Fisher observed in his Pulitzer Prize-winning work, Washington's Crossing, and I quote, "For the American troops, it was a great victory. For their general, it was a model of a brilliantly managed defensive battle in the same town where Colonel Johann Rahl's Hessian Brigade had fought, but with very different results." Unquote. Had the rebel army failed to stop the advance of the elite British and Hessian units at ASSUNPINK Creek, the result would in all probability have been the destruction of that army, and possibly with it the cause of American independence. And that scenario would almost certainly have entailed fatal consequences for Washington, shown here in another Trumbull painting on the banks of the Assunpink Creek in the evening hours of January 2nd. As I said, would have almost certainly entailed fatal consequences for GW, either on the battlefield or at the end of a British rope, the latter being the penalty prescribed for treason against the King of England. And here we have a shot from a couple of winters ago of the current Assunpink Creek Bridge on South Broad Street, which is on the site of the 1770 bridge, which was then on Queen Street, where the most intense fighting occurred in the early evening hours of January 2nd, 1777. In the second volume of his Rev-War trilogy, Valiant Ambition, Nathaniel Philbrick opines that if Cornwallis's effort to cross this bridge, not this bridge, but the other bridge, and overrun the rebel army had succeeded, and I quote, "the war was as good as finished," unquote. For the capital city of Philadelphia would surely have fallen that winter, and the Continental Congress, which had fled to Baltimore, might very well have decided that a negotiated settlement was in the country's best interests. By choosing to fight on this ground on January 2nd, Philbrick writes, and I quote, "Washington had managed to conflate the standoff at the Old North Bridge in Concord with the Battle of Bunker Hill in Charleston to create what was, even if it is largely unappreciated today, the make or break moment of the War of Independence," unquote. Another historian, Mark Malloy, in his recent book about the battles of Trenton and Princeton, shared this assessment of how precarious the American position at Assunpink Creek was on that day, writing, and I quote, "If the British were able to penetrate Washington's lines or roll up on his flanks, there would be no place to retreat, and his army would be completely crushed. It was important that they prevent the British regulars from crossing the Assunpink at all. The outnumbered Americans appeared to be in a dangerous predicament that could have ended the entire rebellion," end of quote. Of course, historians of the Revolution never mention Assunpink Creek in the same breath as battles such as Saratoga or Yorktown, probably the most recognized and significant engagements in that struggle, with the former in 1777 leading to France's crucial intervention in the contest, and the latter in 1781 breaking the back of England's will to fight against the colonials. But those later engagements might very well have never occurred if January 2nd, 1777 had turned out differently for Washington's army. The events of that day, including the delaying action by Colonel Edward Hand's men and the fighting at the creek, possibly created a deciding moment of as great consequence for the cause of American independence as the far better known confrontations that occurred later in the war. Perhaps no military action in our country's history is more paradoxical than the one on the road to Assunpink Creek and at the bridge that crossed it, in the sense that its obscurity in the public mind and neglect by so many historians is so disproportionate to its impact on the course of a conflict with global implications. And here's Edward Hand in an image that I would like to entitle "A Whig Looking for His Wig," but that's not the title. So I'm going to wrap up my remarks by reading an excerpt from the last chapter in the book. This is from chapter 9, Gathering Laurels, and I guess you could say it's my ode to Edward Hand, to whose memory, along with that of his men, the book is dedicated. Pardon me while I wet my whistle. It's only water, don't worry. Of all the Crown's military principles, Cornwallis was best equipped by talent and temperament to secure that final victory over Washington. It has been argued that his lordship should have been the outstanding British general in the American Revolution, based on his combat experience, his military academy training, and a knowledge of strategy and tactics far surpassing that of the average British officer. But whatever his record and abilities, Cornwallis ran out of time when his men were detained by the muddy road conditions that impeded their advance from Princeton to Trenton, and by the fierce resistance that was mounted by an outnumbered but battle-tested and obstinate band of Continental skirmishers along that route. It might be said that the weather was guided by the hand of fate, and the defenders by the hand of Pennsylvania. The man who led the Pennsylvania riflemen and others in their running battle with Cornwallis's juggernaut on January 2nd, 1777, has been ranked among those American officers who had that special aptitude for leading men in battle, and were, when the chips were down, capable of delivering the best any general could demand. When the fate of the Continental Army that embodied the Patriot cause hung in the balance, the colonel's hardy few urgently needed to fulfill George Washington's demand for exemplary soldiering against a formidable invader. One might judge their readiness to meet that challenge by employing a time-honored means of interpreting human affairs. That is, by borrowing a line from Shakespeare. The way his character Mercutio memorably describes his fatal wound in Romeo and Juliet is how the Bard of Avon might have regarded Edward Hand's small but steadfast contingent. And I quote, "'Tis not so deep as a well, nor so wide as a church door, but 'tis enough, 'twill serve." Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was terrific. And I always, when I'm talking about the Battle of Assunpink Creek, as David pointed out at the beginning, it's commonly referred to as the Second Battle of Trenton. The Army considers the Battle of Assunpink Creek as a part of the Princeton campaign. So it's more correctly the First Battle of Princeton. So we'll ask, we got some good questions for David, which we will ask him after our next author. So I am pleased to present our next author, which is Jerry Hurwitz. Jerry is the President Emeritus of the Princeton Battlefield Society and a member of the Company of Military Historians. He's an attorney, author of magazine articles on the American Revolution, and a member of the 43rd Regiment of Foot and the 2nd Pennsylvania Regiment, Continental Regiment. He's a graduate of Lehigh University and
that's about us.
Connecticut,
I don't understand.
University of Connecticut Law School. So I've got to see who is unmuted here so that I can make sure everybody is muted. All right, there we go. So Jerry, I'm going to turn it over now to you.
Thank you, Roger, and welcome everyone who's attending and wants to learn more about the near massacre at Fort Griswold. And I guess the first question is, why is this so important? Why did I choose to call it the Alamo of the Revolution? And the fact that it is rather obscure, I think, an event that took place during the American Revolution that I guess most people don't know about. And I think that most historians probably know very little about. It was largely overlooked by the fact that of its proximity to the final major engagement of the American Revolution, which was the battle and siege at Yorktown, which took place, was just starting really just about the time the battle at Fort Griswold took place, and culminated in the surrender of Cornwallis's army and effectively ended major operations in America during the Revolution. So, but it was a calamitous event. It certainly was the bloodiest engagement ever witnessed on the soil of the state of Connecticut. The casualties, the percentage of casualties was really more akin to an American Civil War engagement than an engagement that took place during the American Revolution. You really had losses that amounted to 80% of the American defenders. I think it was mentioned earlier, there were 88 killed in the fort. This is out of a total garrison of about 160. When I say garrison, it was a lot of militiamen that entered into the fort to help bolster the garrison of only 25 men. So, and there were 41 wounded. Another 23 were taken prisoner and sent to New York's Sugar House, which was a death sentence in and of itself. So the casualties were horrendous for the small town of Groton. Most of those people lived in Groton, in and around Groton. And for the British, it was also horrendous. The attackers who amounted to about anywhere between 600 and 750. We don't know the precise number of the regulars that were there, and they were British regulars from the 40th Regiment and the 54th Regiment that did the assault. They lost close to 200 of their men in attacking the fort. So you can look at that and say it's a quarter to a third of the attackers were casualties. So whichever way you look at it, it was a tremendous loss. Besides all the other destruction inflicted on the towns of Groton and New London. Now, the origins of the attack and assault on New London go back to New London being probably the best seaport, deep water seaport in Connecticut. And for a variety of reasons, probably because of the Fort Griswold, which overlooked the harbor and was meant to keep British ships, attackers from coming up the Thames River. It was a serious deterrent to making an assault coming up the river. The other reason being the other two fortifications, which turned out not to be very defensible at all. originally the New London was bottled up by a blockading Royal Navy that ranged from Newport, Rhode Island, which was occupied, and New York City. And many of the towns along the Connecticut shore were raided, burnt, like New Haven, Stratford, Norwalk. All of these towns became victims to British raiding parties. So it maybe should not have been a big surprise that New London eventually was going to come up on the list. And Benedict Arnold was a proponent of attacking New London. One of the reasons, of course, is that he knew the defenses so well. He grew up in the area. He knew people there. There were spies there, obviously, for him to get detailed information. But he also knew the defenses as being an American commander who had visited the defenses out there back in 1777. So he knew about the layout, and he also knew the signal for calling out the militia and how to frustrate that signal. So he was the right person to engage, to launch and lead this expedition, this punitive expedition that really was brought about by the taking of one particular ship, the Hannah, which was intended for New York, the garrison, for the officers at New York, and was taken and brought in as a prize ship to New London. And the British officers were pretty unhappy about it. Not to mention the captain of the ship, who made his way and complained loudly of why was this nest of pirates being allowed to go unmolested and basically pick off the various merchantmen that were trading between England and New York. So Arnold volunteered. He was itching for something to do. He got a expeditionary force of about 1,732 men together, and had his plans all laid out. He knew how he was going to do this, and he didn't expect that he was going to meet much resistance. He knew that the forts were very undermanned. 25 men to defend a fort that had 23 guns. And that was Fort Griswold, and also that Fort Trumbull was not even a fort, really. It was a water battery. It was open in the back. And then the other fort, the other American fort that was on the New London side, which was supposed to cover the back of Fort Trumbull, was called Fort Nonsense by everyone. So you can imagine that he didn't think much of that either. And he was ready to go. The Americans were tipped off by a spy that this expedition was coming the night before. And Colonel Ledyard, who was the commanding officer of the entire region, made preparations to go to Fort Griswold and bring in, supplies, ammunition that might be needed, and also to try to recruit people from the privateers, because there were insufficient number of people trained to man the cannon. So he went to the privateers, which again, they were the targets of this particular raid. So he prepared to go across, and with him, he had presupposed that against the signals would work, everything would work out. And the British expeditionary force showed up about 3 a.m, except that the winds were against them. They couldn't land their troops. And of course, the Americans spotted them from Fort Griswold. And they immediately set off the alarm, setting up basically having 2 alarm guns go off to alert the numerous militia that lived within hearing distance to come out to help defend New London and Groton from the attack. Unfortunately, there was a loophole in all of this, and that was that if you fired 3 cannon shots instead of 2, it meant you were bringing in a prize ship, and Arnold knew that, so he fired that shot. I would like Roger, if you could perhaps show a picture of the map, of Lyman's map, to show what the attacking force was going to be confronting here. There's my book. That's, by the way, that is a painting done by Don Troiani, which I think dramatically shows the final stages of the assault against the south wall of Fort Griswold. And you can see the flag coming down. But anyways, we'll get into that story. Well, here's the Thames River. You can see it's quite broad at its mouth, about 3 miles as you go up. You can see on the left-hand side in the corner, I don't know if you can at all enlarge this picture, Roger, is that possible?
I don't think so, but.
Okay, well,
What
anyway.
do you want me to point to?
Left-hand side, on the left hand, you see 2 hills, you see a little white spot. Yeah, can you point? Yes, okay, that is Fort Trumbull. That's where Fort Trumbull was located. And Fort Town Hill is really on that, looks like that line that you see there, that's a road, an avenue coming up from the beach. On the other side, on a promontory, you can see Fort Griswold. Maybe you can point where that is. There's Fort Griswold. Now, Fort Griswold had an elevation of about 120 feet. It was 200 feet from the Thames River, and its heavy guns could reach the harbor. It was the best defensive position, and it's at the end of what's called a glacial moraine. So the British, you could see, they're landed on both sides of the Thames River. Arnold realized that the key to success was going to be taking out Fort Griswold, because that would allow British ships to come up. It would also prevent the privateers from escaping north on the Thames River up to Norwich. There was a bar and they could escape. The problem that everybody had at the time was that they didn't have the wind. The wind was lacking, and Arnold had to sit offshore for 6 hours before he was able to start landing his men on both sides of the Thames River. Now, he commanded the forces on the western side of the Thames, the New London side, and had the land approach. And he had very little trouble in making it through there. And the militia were totally disorganized. The commanding officer of the militia regiment in charge of the defense had a headache, and he decided he was leaving at the beginning of the fight. He decided that he was too sick to lead, and he never designated any subordinate to take over the defense. So there really was no effective defense to New London. And Fort Nonsense, which the British called Fort Folly, was precisely that. They didn't put up much of a defense either. And so therefore, he was able to come into New London and really burn down the town, take out whatever ships that could not escape or had not taken the opportunity to escape to go up the Thames River. And he was essentially accomplished what he had meant to accomplish. But before he had gotten there, he had signaled, he had sent a ship, a small boat across the Thames River, instructing the British commander on the western part of the expedition, Colonel Eyre, to hurry up and to get to the fort, because there were still some privateers trying to escape upriver, and he wanted to stop them by having the guns of the fort fire on them. Well, Eyre did get up there, and of course the fort, unfortunately for Arnold thought there were only 25 men in the garrison. He could not see or realize that there were 160 men in the fort at that point in time, and that they were ready to defend that fort. And the fort was in much better shape than he had remembered it to be. So the British were bound to assault it. They did a parley and tried to induce the American commander, Ledyard, to surrender. They even told Ledyard that no men would be taken prisoner. They would all be put to the sword. Essentially, what they would call the rules of war would apply, which meant once they got into the fort, no one could expect to be taken prisoner. So that's, again, a kind of akin to what happened at the Alamo, where you said, of course, there they carried it out. No one was permitted to live after they captured the Alamo. So, but the Americans put up a defense, and they came in, the British, and tried to attack the corners, tried to reduce their casualties. And Americans were still trying to get into the fort. There were whole families in the fort. There were everybody was related to one another. Example, like the Averys had 9 of them were killed. Another 4 were seriously wounded, and another 4 were carried off as prisoner. So it was like, as I said, major parts of families were impacted by this engagement. There, as you could see, the fort. That is looking at the north gate. That's the north wall that you see. You see 2 bastions. Those are on the riverside. The one over on the right, that is the northwest bastion, and below is the southwest bastion. Now that southwest bastion is very important. That is the key. That was the key to the fort, really. And nobody knew about it at the time. So you see that is, and also over in the corner of the, if you look down to the, which would be the southeast corner, is where there was an 18, the largest cannon in the fort was located, and that would have an impact also. So they came up, they assaulted the fort. Now the fort had phrasing, which is these long, extended, sharpened poles that were embedded into the earthen walls of the fort at a height of about 8 feet. In other words, it would be reach up to get at it, and they were placed in such a manner as to impede anybody trying to climb into the fort. If they had had scaling ladders, it wouldn't have made any difference. You still could not get by the phrasing. So they had and they also had enfilading guns. Now, there's a picture, there's some pictures in here that I'm going to show you also, which I'd like to, Roger, if you could show. All right, there's the fort, and there
Barry,
is.
We've got about 5 minutes. We got about 5 minutes before we go to question and answer.
Okay, all right. Well, let me explain what makes this battle so important, and it has to also do with the mix of people that were in there. You had 2 black men in the fort that both were active in the fighting. One of them was Jordan Freeman. He was kind of a hero in the engagement. He was a hero in the engagement. That is the, by the way, you're seeing there the southwest bastion, and you were seeing where the enfilading cannon would have been located along that south wall. It would have been devastating for anybody trying to get up over over the wall because of the enfilading fire. Anyways, what happened was there's a fatal flaw in the fort, and that is the inclusion of a glacial boulder into the wall. It should never have been part of the fort, but it was done. It was an easy way out. The problem with it is it was perpendicular, which, in other words, everything else was angled so that a defender could shoot at the attacker coming up. But if it's absolutely perpendicular, you can't do that effectively without fully exposing yourself. 2, they couldn't have any phrasing. So if somebody could climb up on that boulder, and the boulder was a bit broken up, they could climb up into the bastion. And that's exactly what happened. And they found that weakness accidentally. There was another couple of incidences that occurred which made it so bloody. One of which was the flagpole, as you can see in the southwest bastion. The halyard was shot after the British had lost their first commanding officer, and Major Montgomery had taken over. They were hesitating about continuing the assault. But when the flag went down, they assumed the Americans were surrendering. And the Americans very quickly found a half pike to attach the flag and to say, hey, we're not surrendering. Don't mistake this, that we're surrendering, that we lowered our flag. But it was too late, really. The British thought it was a dirty trick being played upon them, and to induce them to come approach the fort so the Americans can get another shot at them. And they were enraged by that, and they redoubled their efforts in attacking the fort. Eventually, when they silenced the cannon, the 9-pounder, they started to climb up and get through the phrasing. And Montgomery was leading his men through one of the open embrasures. In fact, that is the wall that you're looking at, which is the south wall. You're looking at it from the inside of the fort, from the open gate. And that is approximately where, directly in front of you, directly where the embrasure was located that Major Montgomery was coming through. And it just, of course, turns out that there was sort of a mobile defense force on the parade, which consisted of, I'm sure Ledyard, but certainly Jordan Freeman, and he had a half pike. And when he saw Montgomery coming through the embrasure leading his men, he used that pike to impale the attacking major, killing him. So that was quite an event, and it is commemorated by a plaque that's in the fort. The other thing that's important is that once they got into the fort, they were able to overwhelm that southwest bastion and open up the gate, the north gate. Someone ran across and opened up the gate and let all the attackers that are on the north side of the fort into the fort. And the game was up at that point in time. And Ledyard tried to surrender. So the story goes, he tried to surrender, and that he tendered his sword, and that the sword was taken and by the British officer accepting the sword, and then he was slain with it. And he was slain, and also Jordan Freeman was slain, his orderly, and his nephew, who was an officer in the militia. So that was a story, but the waistcoat, which survived and shows the openings for where the thrust took place, are consistent with a bayonet wound and not with a sword cut. So we don't think that's really true. The other thing is there was a Native American in the fort who was wounded, a Pequot Indian. Now, he wasn't part of the militia, and he wasn't part of the garrison, either of the Fort Trumbull garrison or the Fort Griswold garrison. So I figured he can't come from the ship. He had to come from one of the privateers. And there was a history of Native Americans serving on ships. They were very good at doing that. So I assume he was wounded in action, and that he was manning one of the cannon.
So
So
Jerry, let me just ask you if I could. So what was what would you say, was there any significance to this battle other than the fact that it was just a horrific defeat for these defenders? Was there any tactical or strategic significance to this battle?
None at all. Absolutely none at all. In other words, yes, they did take out the privateers. I suppose that would count as a victory for the British in taking out the privateers. But the losses they took in assaulting Fort Griswold was a complete Pyrrhic victory. It wasn't worth the sacrifice of lives that took place to take that fort.
Okay.
You didn't need to take it. And it was all by accident, by misconceptions. The Americans also were not really prepared. They were not prepared. They didn't have prepared cartridges for the cannon they were firing. There was a group of militia that were standing about 500 yards off to the north that the American defenders could see, and were hoping they would come into the fort, and they never did.
Okay, let me switch to David. David, what did Washington learn from the Hessians? This comes from VPG Brooks Lyles of the SAR. What did Washington learn from the fighting the Hessians in Trenton that they were able to successfully apply less than a week later at the Battle of Assunpink Creek?
Well, I think, I'm not sure what you mean by learn from the Hessians. It was apparent to Washington and his officers, I believe, when they were at Trenton during that first battle, that the high ground below the creek, which would have been on the southern edge of the town of Trenton, that was potentially a strong defensive position. And that in fact, one of the Continental officers later writes about this in his memoirs, James Wilkinson, I believe, excuse me, that if the Hessians had been able to withdraw across the stone bridge, the Trenton Bridge that was there at the time, onto that high ground, that they would have been in a much more secure defensive position and much more able to resist the American attack. So I think that, once Washington's men made their return to Trenton over the last 3 days, I guess it was, of December, when they crossed the Delaware. They had gone back to PA after that first battle, and then they crossed back to Trenton, fourth time in that month that they crossed the river.
So another one for you, David. Can you comment on the artillery battle at ASSUNPINK? Did the British have a numerical advantage of artillery?
Yeah, that battle has often been referred to as more of a cannonade than anything else. I think the locals called it that, the cannonade at Trenton or something like that, long afterwards. The Americans had an advantage, numerical advantage in artillery, about 40 to 28. The British had heavier guns. They had 12 pounders. I don't know that all their cannon were 12 pounders. They had 12 pounders, but the Americans had the advantage in terms of numbers of cannon. And the cannon played a major role in that battle, as the American cannon, as they did in all three battles of the 10 crucial days. That's a common denominator to those three engagements. Washington's army had a numerical advantage in artillery in all three battles, and the artillery played a crucial role in all three battles, none more so than at Assunpink Creek. And Washington was able to concentrate much of his artillery, probably about half of the total number of guns he had, which were spread out over, his men were spread out over about a 3-mile line on the southern end of the creek, but he concentrated about half of the artillery on that narrow stone bridge, so that when the British and Hessians attempted to cross late on that January 2nd, they were receiving cannon fire as well as musket and rifle fire from three sides, and it created a bloody, an event of enormously bloody consequences for the British and Hessian troops.
Jerry, was the British officer that killed Ledyard ever identified?
No, and I mean, it's if the surviving Weska tells any story, he was not killed by an officer. He would have been, because unless the officer was using a bayonet, he would have been killed by a regular British soldier, probably. Again, there's no evidence that a sword was used to slay Colonel Ledyard. So that story, which came out by Stephen Hempstead many, many years, decades after the battle, I'd never mentioned before until he came out with his memoir, that had occurred, and no one else seems to have witnessed what had happened. So it seems to be a myth that Ledyard was killed with his own sword by the British officer accepting it.
So I have time for one more question here. David, how significant were the reinforcements from Cadwalader's Pennsylvania militia that marched the night through Crosswicks in the Battle of Assunpink?
I don't know that I wouldn't say that they played a decisive role in the battle. They were, they certainly helped. They were not in the area. They were, I would say, on the periphery of the area where the most intense fighting occurred, in and around the stone bridge across the creek. So they were playing a supportive role, a backup role to the Continental Army units, the regular units that were the primary line of defense, if you will. So I'd say they helped, but I would not, I would hesitate to say their role was crucial. But you know, I was significant, I would say, in the context of the story of his brigade, in that I would assume it was their first exposure to fire in a battlefield environment.
So I would add to that, that what's interesting about these new, fresh reinforcements joining Washington for the Battle of Assunpink Creek was the fact that the Battle of Trenton, when word got out about the Battle of Trenton, there was certainly it was important for Washington's forces to be reinforced to carry on this, what was a winter campaign. And while some of the experienced Continentals left after the first Battle of Trenton, it bolstered Washington and encouraged him to make the next engagement in Princeton. So I want to thank my guests tonight. Honestly, folks, we have scratched the surface on these two battles, both with David Price's book, The Road to Assunpink Creek, and Jerry Hurwitz's book, The Alamo of the Revolution. These are not long books, but they are engaging. There are illustrations, there are maps inside both of these books. And while Jerry made the point that the battle itself may not have claimed strategic significance, it certainly was significant in the memory of Benedict Arnold's treasonous role, and the fact that we are at the end of the war. It is also significant to realize that the battles at the last few years of the war were terribly vicious and terribly violent. That's not to say that the battles at the beginning of the war weren't violent, but it was really brother against brother. So tonight, I thank you all for joining us. I thank David Perkins from my compatriot from the Connecticut Society of Sons of the American Revolution. And to Dwight Elam, yes, I will be at conference. Thank you, sir. So I thank all my SAR compatriots who joined us tonight, all of my regulars. I will be posting some future shows. I'm taking another couple of weeks off because I'm going to next week, actually this weekend, I'm going to the Sons of the American Revolution Conference of the American Revolution in Detroit. And as compatriot Elam just asked me, am I going to Congress in July? I've got the National Congress of the Sons of the American Revolution. And there's been some interesting conversations going on with the Congress of the American Revolutionary War roundtables, which I will be attending that meeting in November. As always, thank you all for joining me on History Author Talks. And I look forward to seeing you for our next program. And have a great week, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you, Roger.
Take care, all.
All right.